History as it happens, February 21st, 2023. 1 year of war.
The Cold War days are over.
The Cold War is over.
The Cold War is over.
With the Cold War behind us, we also want to move toward partnership between our militaries.
But I don't believe anyone could ever have doubted that there would be obstacles on Russia's road to a vibrant economy and a strong democracy.
First, I'd like to congratulate President Putin for being the only person that caught a fish today.
Единоличном лидерстве в современном, именно в современном мире.
In Bucharest, we must make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula.
Russia is a regional power.
After months of preparations, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has launched a major military operation against Ukraine.
Rather than change course, however, President Putin has doubled down, choosing not to end the war, but to expand it.
Long before today, Russian President Vladimir Putin expected to conquer Ukraine. Instead, his invasion bogged down, and victory a year later is nowhere in sight. A long war seems to be in the offing, provided the United States and NATO continue aiding Ukraine's defenders. Meanwhile, the debate over the war's origins rages on. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Every war is a battle over origins. You can definitely see that with World War I, or I think that will be true for the current war, that there will be a fight when it starts to terminate about why it happened, and for that reason we really need to think hard about it now, in a sense, to be ready for that fight.
February 10th, 2007. Vladimir Putin addresses world leaders at the Munich Security Conference. This is 7 years into his rule, 4 years after he and other European powers tried and failed to convince George Bush not to invade Iraq. In words he may want to repeat to himself today, Putin said unilateral and frequently illegitimate actions have not resolved any problems. Moreover, said Putin, they have caused new human tragedies and created new centers of tension. Putin warned his audience that Russia wanted no part of a unipolar world. He said NATO expansion is a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have a right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Well, contrary to Putin's story, Soviet leaders did not get a guarantee that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch beyond the old Cold War dividing line in Germany. That was something Secretary of State Baker suggested in a conversation with Gorbachev in early 1990, not official U.S. policy. Still, NATO enlargement always proved to be a sensitive matter with Russian leaders after the Cold War. Yeltsin didn't like it, but relented because his country was too weak to stop it.
This partnership opens the door to cooperation with all of NATO's former adversaries, including Russia, Ukraine, and the other newly independent states. NATO can do for Europe's East what it did for Europe's West.
Anyways, the year after Putin's remarks at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, President Bush had this to say at the Bucharest conference.
This week, our alliance must also decide how to respond to the request by Georgia and Ukraine to participate in NATO's membership action plan. These two nations inspired the world with their rose and orange revolutions, and now they're working to consolidate their democratic gains and cement their independence. Welcoming them into the membership action plan would send a signal to their citizens that if they continue on the path to democracy and reform, they will be welcomed into the institutions of Europe. It would send a signal throughout the region that these two nations are and will remain sovereign and independent states.
Well, as we all know, Ukraine never made it into NATO or the EU. And in 2014, Russian troops made their way into Crimea.
We've seen an illegal referendum in Crimea, an illegitimate move by the Russians to annex Crimea.
And soon they were backing a separatist war in the Donbas. 8 years later, February 2022, Putin ordered an invasion for the rest of Ukraine. The origins of this terrible war cannot be found in the conflict over NATO expansion alone. There is nothing monocausal here. After all, this is a regional war between Russia and Ukraine, two nations with a complex relationship predating Ukrainian independence in 1991 by centuries. In the Journal of Democracy, Michael McFaul and Robert Person argue that Putin only wants you to believe this is about NATO. What he really fears, they say, is democracy next door in a nation Moscow used to dominate. So the invasion is about anti-democratic regime change. So there is no shortage of plausible explanations as to why Putin decided to roll the dice last February. What is clear is the war has been a disaster, above all for Ukraine, whose people have been killed, maimed, massacred, bombed out of their homes, and forced to flee to other countries. The war has also forced Americans to rethink what's in their national interest, whether the fate of the so-called liberal world order is tied to Ukraine's survival, and if so, how far the U.S. should go to help Ukraine win.
The idea that we're going to send in offensive equipment and have planes and tanks and trains going in with American pilots and American crews, just understand, and don't kid yourself, no matter what you all say, that's called World War III.
This is the first episode in a two-part series for the anniversary of the Russian invasion. We'll be joined by Catholic University historian Michael Kimmage, an expert on U.S.-Russian relations. From 2014 to 16, he worked at the State Department, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. But first, we're going to check in with the Washington Times national security team leader, Guy Taylor. He and his team produced several reports on the first year of the war, and you can find those this week at WashingtonTimes.com. Hello, Guy.
Hey, Martin. How are you?
You've become a regular on the podcast this year. What's happening there?
My honor.
Yeah, well, that's me inviting you, so there's the explanation. When it comes to explanations, causation, trying to figure out what's going on inside the Kremlin, your piece for the anniversary of the Russian invasion deals with Vladimir Putin's thinking, his strategic mindset. Has he lost touch with reality? Is he consumed by grievances, or is there a rational thought process here? What did you learn?
Part of our deep dive focuses on what's inside the mind of Putin a year into this war. Is he sane? Is he a cunning megalomaniac? Is he a disaster artist, or what? This is a debate that's been playing out since before the invasion started a year ago. For part of this, we actually feature an interview with Ken DeCleva, the former State Department regional medical officer who served for years in Moscow. And Ken has done deep dive psychological profiles on foreign leaders, including Putin, for the U.S. government. And he says that Putin is definitely not insane, but rather can best be characterized by the three R's: rational, ruthless, and resilient. And if we were at a fourth R, it would be revanchist. The third one being really important vis-a-vis the status of the war in Ukraine. Basically, there's consensus in the U.S. intelligence community that Putin was likely misinformed by Russia's primary intelligence agencies on the direction the invasion of Ukraine would take. In many ways, the invasion was a disaster and an example of a Russian intelligence failure, because Putin was advised that it would be over very quickly, that in fact Russian troops would succeed and that the Zelensky government would collapse quickly, Zelensky would flee, the West was not prepared to stand up, NATO would respond by recoiling. Putin found himself really in a corner by last summer with what to do, and this resilience factor came into play, and he really responded by reshaping the campaign.
So your point about Putin being misled by his intelligence services, what about the idea that they were telling him what he wanted to hear?
Absolutely. I mean, there's this idea of a security elite in the Kremlin and in Moscow and surrounding Putin that thinks in a groupthink, and that in that groupthink, Putin is not told adversarial points of view that may be closer tethered to the truth. At the same time, I don't think it's a surprise that there were predictions that this would be over quickly. The United States and the Western intelligence agencies had similar analysis at the time. There was not a lot of confidence around Zelensky in the lead up to the war. There was not this sense that you were going to have this rallying of a government in Kyiv that said, we don't want to flee, we want weapons. So it's possible that this was just a big intelligence failure on all sides, and that this war has a life of its own. It's sort of churning onward. One of the big things that we look at in the series is this other consensus now among the eastern flank of NATO and Eastern European leaders, but also in Washington, is this idea this thing is going to be going on for a while. It's not going to be over in April, that both sides are arming up as we head into the springtime. Everyone is anticipating more and more Russian troops. The number of Russian troops inside Ukraine as of early February was about twice as many as the 110,000 or so that Putin deployed to carry out the initial invasion. The number of Russians that have been mobilized is also going up. So the Russians are going to throw more troops into Ukraine. That's the prediction. All the while, the Ukrainian military is getting more training from NATO and more equipment. The consensus is that things are likely to get potentially a lot worse before there's some sort of a peace negotiation.
There does seem to be some evidence as we look ahead to 2023 here that the Russians and Putin are adjusting, they're adapting, and they're going to learn from their earlier mistakes?
It seems that way, or things could get worse. I also think we have to look at this bigger picture notion of strategic desires for Putin. Somehow he wants to restore the Soviet Union to its former glory. The analysis that I've highlighted in our reporting focuses more on what would be described as Putin's czarist desires, that he wants to restore Russia to its pre-Soviet Union glory, and that includes absorbing Ukraine. At the same time, first of all, with regard to that, we have to remember that Vladimir Putin famously told George W. Bush more than a decade ago that Ukraine is not a country. It's not a country. That's been his view the entire time, and that it explains Russia's posture around the 2014 annexation of part of eastern Ukraine as well as the Crimean Peninsula. And it can also help explain this sort of roll to war that we saw a year ago. But when I say czarist desires, you have to remember that Ukraine, a big part of it is Russian speaking, and there's this mentality among that security elite, people that were really politically and psychologically impacted and damaged by the collapse of the Soviet Union, that want to reabsorb historically Russian territory back to the czarist era, and that Putin views himself as this czarist figure in the 21st century. So there's all kinds of what used to be called during the Soviet Union Kremlinology, where Western analysts and journalists sit around and try and theorize and unpack these things. What we do in our series is we bake most of it into statements of fact. More than 7,000 Ukrainian civilians killed over the past year, many of them children, more than 500. 8 million people now spread across Western Europe living as refugees, the vast majority of them women and children. Atrocities and war crimes are being carried out. At least there's some obvious documentation of that when you look at Bucha. It's disturbing. There hasn't been leadership to end this war in some way, and that it's likely to get worse before we get to that point.
Guy Taylor, thank you, my friend. And again, you can find his work on the Russian invasion of Ukraine 1 year later at WashingtonTimes.com. And in part 2 of the series, our next episode, the Washington Times' Ben Wolfgang is going to drop by to tell us what he's working on. Now, as Michael Kimmage, historian, Catholic University, reminds me, in every war there's a battle over its origins, and we need to approach this matter with some humility. It's possible some things, like what's going on in Putin's head, may remain a mystery. Welcome back, Michael Kimmage.
Great to be here, Martin. Great to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you back in the studio. I see that your cab finally made it through D.C. traffic to get here. You know, it's touch and go for a bit. So you're writing a book about the war while it's still going on. Before we get to our retrospective on the past year, how are you writing a book about something that's not over yet?
Well, it's a very fair question. So one solution to the problem, and this is what the book is it's a history of the origins of the war. So it looks into the background, the context, the things that brought us to where we are at the present moment. I mean, present moment is sort of a year ago, February 2022, although the book does dip a little bit into the actual war, but it's much more a study of origins and the path to war than it is of the war itself.
That's very timely, and I did not mean to imply that you were doing a play-by-play of the battles each day, because then you'd be constantly having to update it. You'd never be able to publish the book. Maybe you agree with me that sometimes this emphasis on how we got here, debates about NATO, Russia in the 1990s, Putin's mindset, the EU, Ukrainian politics, whatever. It sounds a little out of touch when bombs and bullets are flying and people are being killed. But for our purposes here in our comfortable studio, I think it's critical to understand these things, don't you?
Well, it's not just for people in comfortable studios, although they should be certainly trying their best to understand the war. There are a lot of implications for policymakers in terms of understanding how the war began. If you have a clear understanding of it, I think that will give you a clear understanding of the war itself. And if it's muddled, then the war will seem muddled. And then additionally, every war, as it comes close to a conclusion, every war is a battle over origins. You can definitely see that with World War I. Germany had one version, the stab in the back, and Britain, France, and the United States had another version. Even the Second World War, there are lots of differences between the Soviet Union and the United States about how it came about, and that bled into the Cold War. And the Cold War itself is a battle often over the origins of the war. I think that will be true for the current war, that there will be a fight when it starts to terminate about why it happened, and for that reason we really need to think hard about it now, in a sense, to be ready for that fight.
And someone might say, well, what do you mean? We know why the war began. Russia invaded. Well, we're not trying to make excuses for that. We're trying to understand why in February of 2022, as opposed to some other time, Vladimir Putin and his ruling circle decided that war was the right way, or would be the best way, or maybe even the easiest way to solve whatever issues they had, however unjustified that step was, right?
Well, I don't think that the moral questions when it comes to the war's origins are especially difficult. It seems to me like the war is unnecessary and in many respects criminal. That responsibility is on the shoulders of Vladimir Putin and those in his inner circle. That matters a lot. That's very significant. It's a core fact of the war, but it's not one of the big intellectual problems of the war, because in a sense it's sort of as clear as Hitler's decision to invade Poland in 1939 is sort of as clear as that. But why the war happened in a bigger sense, what brought us to this point, that is intellectually very complicated, or even why Putin made the bet that he did in February of 2022, whatever is going to come of it. To try to figure out that is not as clear-cut, and it's a very significant task.
Is it even possible to say who is winning now? And what has surprised you about this first year of war? Maybe something about the nature of modern warfare.
Well, the nature of modern warfare is surprisingly traditional, 20th century traditional, but the military hardware on both sides certainly matters a great deal. The tank battles have been very significant. Air power has played a role, but you've also had, infantry combat of the kind that you had in the First World War, certainly in the Second World War. And I don't know if that comes as a huge surprise, but I think we had been conditioned a little bit before the war began to thinking of war in very high-tech terms, that it would be cyber warfare, it would be sort of what was called hybrid warfare, kind of half media, half military, and this is really a military conflict with a lot of very traditional components. So that's, I think, one surprise, one modest surprise. Obviously, the strengths of the Ukrainian military, if you look at the war as most experts did before it began, have been surprising. Not only that they retained their strength in the first month of the war, which wasn't a given, but they've integrated technology very, very successfully. You can send a lot of missiles and sophisticated weaponry to a country. It doesn't mean that they're going to put it to good use, but clearly they showed in September, October that they were able to not just defend Ukraine, but go on the offensive. And I think that that's something of a surprise as well. But as to who's winning, that's an immensely difficult question. Clearly Ukraine has done better than many expected at the outset. They'll probably go on the offensive this spring and summer. They've certainly done very well at mustering international support, financial and military. And to that degree, I think Zelensky has much to be proud of. But 20% of the country is under Russian control. The economy has lost a third of its value. A third of the GDP has been lost over the course of the war. You have millions, maybe over 10 million internally displaced people. and refugees, and the bombs and the missiles continue to fall on Ukrainian cities throughout the country. So I don't know if it's, obviously there are elements of the war that Ukraine is winning, but it seems to me almost cynical under the current circumstances to say this is a war that Ukraine is winning. It's still a war that's very much being fought with civilians paying an immense price.
Certain losses are not going to be recovered, and the loss in time, in life, in treasure, in years spent doing this rather than something more productive, and of course the ripple effects for years to come after this, what this does to Europe and Russia's relationship with the rest of the world. Russia is too large a country, too important a country to be outside the international community, where they are as a result of Putin's decision to invade rather than pursue his interests in more peaceful ways. We've discussed this issue before in an episode called The Wars of Soviet Succession. For anyone listening to this, if they want to go back and listen to that one too, we talked about Russia's pattern of violence, really, interstate violence, since the 1990s. Here is Christopher Caldwell writing an op-ed in the New York Times. He says the United States' recent promise to ship advanced M1 Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine was a swift response to a serious problem. The problem is that Ukraine is losing the war. As he sees it, this is a war of attrition, and Russia has more manpower, more resources. I don't know. I mean, morale certainly is not on the Russian side. We were talking about what's changed about warfare. Morale hasn't. That's still key. Russian conscripts don't believe in what they're fighting for. Ukrainians do.
Well, morale is definitely one problem on the Russian side. I think sometimes social media exaggerates how bad it has been with mobilization and in other domains. I mean, the Russians have sort of continued fighting since the start of the war, but definitely not with the kind of vigor that you see on the Ukrainian side. I mean, there are a lot of problems that may be hidden to the eye at the moment, but could be very real for the Russian military that might make what Christopher Caldwell is saying in this piece a little bit less certain than he's making it out to be. I mean, there are ammunition problems on the Russian side. They've burned through enormous amounts of ammunition, especially important where artillery is concerned. And obviously we don't know where they might be buying this from other sources or producing it themselves, but it looks like they've done quite a job there. And then, of course, casualties and deaths on the Russian side, nobody knows. And the Russians will do everything they can to hide this circumstance, but it looks like it's astonishingly
100,000 already.
Perhaps even 200,000 that's been speculated about. But
it's incredible.
It's sort of almost unfathomable. I think also the degree of just failure on the Russian side, right? You can go back to September, October, and you have the loss of the Kharkiv region, you have the loss of the city of Kherson, you can go back to the summer and you see the loss of, sort of Russian defeats around Kyiv and around Chernihiv. It's a pretty formidable record of failure that the Russian military has amassed in this war. It's not ultimate failure, total failure by any means. I mean, it's an ongoing war in every respect, but, who's winning, who's losing? You can kind of see elements of defeat and victory on both sides. Not quite in equal measure, but on both sides.
Well, the front lines haven't changed very much in a year. If you look at the color-coded maps that are out there, at the end of the day, Russia hasn't really gained that much territory. And in the wake of all this fighting, we have ruined cities, ruined neighborhoods that are going to take years, if not decades, to rebuild.
Well, the destruction has been absolutely horrific. And
all on the Ukrainian side.
Correct. I mean, there have been a few strikes in Russia, a few acts either of Ukrainian intelligence or of sabotage in Russia, but very, very modest. So yes, the line has not moved all that much since February 24th, but the city of Mariupol is the one kind of major Russian trophy, obviously completely destroyed.
And we mean completely.
And they do have a land bridge that now runs through southern Ukraine from Russia to Crimea. So that has been a change, and they have taken some valuable agricultural land and some valuable industrial parts of Ukraine. So it's not trivial what they have under their control, but it's a lot less than they were hoping for.
Absolutely. And from the Ukrainian point of view, if you want to liberate your entire country, then 20% in Russian hands is unacceptable. The land bridge and Crimea, that has geopolitical importance here, the Black Sea, right? So this is not just about ideology or whatever. We're going to get into some of that. Some of this is just geopolitics and the importance of the Black Sea and Sevastopol to Russia, historically and today.
Absolutely. I mean, in the news in the last 2-3 weeks, there were accusations from the government of Moldova that Russia has been trying to stage a coup there, which is entirely believable. And I think one of the areas that we haven't paid so much attention to because the war hasn't spilled over there yet in a big way is Odessa and the other part of southern Ukraine. But I think that's very much in Russia's sights. So I think Kyiv is out of reach for them. But southern Ukraine is something that they're very interested in getting a hold of, in part for cultural, civilizational reasons that they think of this as Russia, but very much for geostrategic reasons.
One more question about what's going on the battlefield right now. Something I haven't been able to figure out, despite having read some articles about this. Why hasn't Russia been able to establish air supremacy?
I wish I had a bit more expertise here. I think that what they did was not prioritize that at the very beginning, and this comes from a somewhat understandable desire on the part of the Russians to have the war be a big surprise. So instead of following their own military doctrine, which would have been...
I'm sorry to interrupt, Michael, but everyone knew the invasion was coming.
I don't know if the Ukrainian government had that assessment
Really?
before it came, and
well, the Biden administration was saying this is going to happen, but
they definitely were saying that, and they had good access to Russian war plans. But there was a lot of uncertainty on the ground, and that could have worked to Russia's strategic advantage had they been more successful in the first couple of weeks. So instead of doing what the Russians would have typically done in a war of this kind, which would have been extensive artillery strikes, airstrikes, before the war begins, in hopes of knocking out Ukraine's air force and air defenses. Instead of doing that, they went for this lightning strike at the beginning, hoping to decapitate the Ukrainian government, but that didn't pan out. And very quickly, Russia got mired in sort of conventional war on the ground around Kyiv and up in the north, and Ukraine was able to hold on to its rather modest air force, but to bolster its air defenses. And then, of course, Western assistance has been crucial in that respect. So they didn't deliver that kind of knockout blow at the beginning, and Russia's living with the consequences of that, which have really impaired the Russian war effort. I mean, if you compare this to Desert Storm, for example, that was also a major invasion, not logistically easy on the part of the U.S. and its partners and allies in Operation Desert Storm, but the air superiority of the U.S. was established and was sort of unimpeachable. And I think also the Iraq War of 2003, that's a very comparable dynamic. So that's U.S. military doctrine. It didn't pan out for Russia that way with this war.
One thing the U.S. had going for it, too, was that it was not fighting an army that was supported by the United States.
Exactly. No, absolutely.
Saddam. Well, I guess at one point we did help Saddam. That was in the 1980s. Uncomfortable historical point there. Well, anyway, Michael Kimmage, back to the beginning of our conversation here. In the debate over why Russia invaded, I see two main arguments that are not mutually exclusive, but are often offered that way. Here is one. Simple Russian imperialism. Putin and his ruling circle embrace an ideological history that says Ukraine is part of Russia, Russia is an expansionist power, and therefore, as Stephen Kotkin, a great historian, put it, what we have today in Russia is not some kind of surprise, it's not some kind of deviation from a historical pattern. Way before NATO existed, said Kotkin in this interview with The New Yorker, in the 19th century, Russia looked like this. It had an autocrat, it had repression, it had militarism, it had suspicion of foreigners and the West. This is a Russia that we know, and it's not a Russia that arrived yesterday or in the 1990s. Now, the other argument I see is that Russia is pursuing what it perceives are its security interests. This argument takes into account decades of Russian objections to NATO expansion and U.S. hegemonic behavior. So rather than dismissing Putin's public objections about NATO and the West as mere propaganda cover for base imperialist motives, this argument takes Russian objections seriously. That may have been the longest setup to any question I've done in my 200-plus episodes of the podcast, Michael, but where do you come down on all of this?
I find it's not an easy question to contemplate, but I find it easy to respond in one way. I think that it's not mutually exclusive. To say that Russia has an imperial mindset, as Steve Kotkin points out, and Steve Kotkin is one of the greatest living interpreters of all of this, past and present, is, I think, pretty close to being objectively the case. If you look carefully at Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s, yes, he was friendly toward the U.S. and Europe, but I suspect that his attitude toward the region bore more than a little trace of imperial sentiment, and Putin has certainly embraced that and made it very much a part of Russian foreign policy, and that cuts along cultural and religious lines, a sense of what is Russia or belongs to Russia, and it's also in tune with the territorial history of the Russian Empire, which is very important to understand for a figure like Putin. It's not maybe so much reconstituting an ancient empire, but it's a sense of entitlement and a sense almost of possession. I think if you take the Russian point of view very seriously, I don't think that you can quite characterize it as imperialism. They're not interested in creating a colony in Ukraine. They see half of Ukraine as Russia. So in a sense, they're liberating that part to be what it is. We almost need a word other than imperialism. But that's, I think, definitely there in Putin's mindset and certainly there in the background.
Yeah, history has played a big part in the war and our interpretations of it. And which history? I mean, I think the post-1991 period is probably more important than, say, the 1700s and Kyiv and Rus.
Definitely. No, definitely. But, that imperial mindset was there on Putin's part, I'm sure, in 2000 when he became Russia's president. And you've seen flickers of it in speeches in 2007. He went to the Munich Security Conference and gave a fire-breathing speech about
no Ukraine in NATO, basically.
Right.
That's what he said.
About that theme and the sort of the place of the United States and Russia's sway and position in Europe. So he's had this, but that doesn't necessarily explain why he went to war in February of 2022. So I think this other explanation, and I don't think it's so much grievances about NATO expansion. I think that takes us down maybe something of a false path. I think what really mattered to Putin after 2014 was a tightening military relationship between Ukraine and the United States, between Ukraine and NATO. It wasn't a NATO member, but there are, sort of exercises that Ukraine conducted with NATO. And in general, Ukraine's movement after 2014 toward the West.
EU, that EU trade deal that Yanukovych, under pressure from Putin, canceled.
Correct. That's what Putin saw as a warning sign, something that he tried to prevent. He really failed spectacularly in preventing Ukraine from moving in that direction. But I think Putin made an assessment, and this is not Putin trying to become Peter the Great or wearing the mantle of Russian Empire. It's not that grand in a way. I think Putin made an assessment, 2020, 2021, 2022, that Ukraine is just moving away from Russia. And if this trend is going to continue for another 5 or 10 years, it will be lost. And it will be so embedded in the West, whether it's the military structures or other structures, that it will be unavailable to Russia. So he had to strike while he could. And that's much more of a military decision, or in a way a political decision that's peripheral to the question of empire. But the two can reinforce each other. And so the empire, I think, plays a big role in the public justification of the war in Russia. But there's an element of strategic thinking that's much more about the future than it is about the past.
Some have described this as a post-colonial war, or part of a process of a collapse of an empire in 1991. And of course, Ukraine has a special place here. We don't talk about these issues with Russia and Poland, Russia and the Baltic states, Russia and other countries. The Russian-Ukraine relationship is unique.
Yes, and we could throw Belarus here in as well, but not that there's much
very close country to Russia, not just geographically.
Right,
culturally,
and there's not much happening in Belarus. I mean, there were protests there in the summer of 2020 about an obviously rigged election, but Belarus for Russia is Eastern Europe as it should be. There's a very close integration between the Belarusian military and the Russian military. I mean, in a way, Belarus is a vassal state of Russia's, and that's something that very comfortably fits in this imperial vision or regional vision. And of course, Ukraine is almost the opposite for Russia. It should be there, but it's not. And so there's an effort and a desire to coerce Ukraine into being where it should be. But this has a lot to do with history, certainly. It has a lot to do with Russia's perceptions of who's a Russian. And many millions of people living in Ukraine, because they're Russian speakers, or in quotation marks, ethnic Russians, are understood to be Russians. And so Russia feels a stake for that reason. And of course, religion is an important part of the story as well.
So about NATO, nothing is monocausal. So just to blame it on NATO, as John Mearsheimer pretty much does, I mean, that's monocausal. I think that debate about NATO expansion to the east, since 91, all through the Yeltsin years, even Gorbachev visited Congress in the 1990s. Gorbachev met members of the U.S. Congress to complain about NATO expansion.
I believe it's a mistake. It's a bad mistake.
И меня не убедят заявления, декларации самого такого респектабельного характера относительно того, что России нечего беспокоить.
And I'm not persuaded by the assurances that we hear that Russia has nothing to worry about.
Нельзя унижать народ, нацию, и нельзя рассчитывать, что это так пройдет.
You may not humiliate a nation, a people, and think that it'll have no consequences.
The point I'm trying to get at, Michael Kimmage, is that it's a reflection of how the U.S.-Russian relationship became ruined over the past 3 decades.
I think that that's very well put.
Because for a time, the U.S.-Russian relationship was pretty good in the early 1990s, despite all the problems that were unfolding in Russia.
Well, I mean, you can find evidence for a good relationship really all the way through up until about 2012. You have George Bush hosts Vladimir Putin in Kennebunkport, Maine at the family compound in 2007.
That's right. That was about a missile system in Poland they were discussing that Russia did not want.
Right. No, they had their tensions, but, that was a sign of friendship to have him not just at the White House, but at a family property. And then, of course, Obama's relationship with Medvedev was pretty warm. The famous hamburger summit in Arlington, Virginia at Ray's Hellburger, where they rolled up their sleeves and enjoyed some hamburgers together and sort of signified to the world that they were not just political partners, but friends. So all of that is there. It's part of the record, and it's important in its own right. I think that it's a mistake to tell this story as primarily, or even in an important way, as a NATO story. I don't think in 2022, when Putin is making his calculations about the war, that NATO is first and foremost on his mind. Obviously, Ukraine's chances of joining NATO in 2022 were pretty remote, as Putin well knew. And NATO is not the immediate problem of Putin in 2022. And in some ways, I don't know if he could foresee this, but by waging the war, he pushed Finland and Sweden
the law of unintended consequences
toward NATO membership. Yeah. So, if weakening NATO was the objective with the war, one can't say that that's been a success for Putin. So I would put it sort of much lower down on the list than others might, or somebody like John Mearsheimer might. But I think that your framing of it, Martin, your framing of the situation is more or less perfect. What NATO is an index of where the relationship was before 2022, and the U.S. wasn't willing to compromise on the open door policy. It wasn't willing to give NATO membership to Ukraine and to other countries, but it wasn't willing to compromise on the open door policy. We could look back in retrospect and say that that was probably a rigidity on the part of the U.S.
Yeah, left Ukraine in a no man's land.
Exactly. That stranded Ukraine in a very, very difficult position, which is a significant circumstance for understanding the war. And also, the whole issue of NATO, Putin can lie about it and he can exaggerate and he can do PR and propaganda around it. But if you would say that NATO is not important to the Russian political elite, you would be getting the situation pretty wrong. You have the memoir of Bill Burns, current director of the CIA, who mentions NATO membership for Ukraine as a red line for Russians.
George
He sort of puts it out there very directly. Does Bill Burns anticipate war and sort of blame anything on the issue of NATO? No, but does he see it as a factor that's important for understanding Russia's strategic culture and some of its decision-making? Of course he does, and that's the right way to look at it.
So why then the timing of February 22? The war had been going on for 8 years. It was a low-level war, a separatist war in only one part of Ukraine. And I have an excellent article here from the New York Times. It was a deep dive on Putin's mindset. I'll just share a couple of passages with you from this article in the New York Times about Putin, Michael. When Mr. Zelensky was elected in a landslide in 2019, the Kremlin saw him as someone it could work with. A Russian-speaking comedian who had lived in Moscow, performed on Russian TV, and won with a message of ending the war in eastern Ukraine that Russia had fueled. And partly because Mr. Zelensky is Jewish, some in Moscow expected him to be tough on Ukraine's nationalist wing, which venerated Ukrainian independence fighters who had fought alongside the Nazis in World War II. And the article goes on to talk about some of the more immediate issues post-2014 in the Minsk agreements that Russia and Ukraine, with varying levels of intensity, try to work out. So I guess what I'm trying to say here, we can assess these more immediate issues rather than only looking at the big historical forces and ideology, etc., to explain why the war began when it did. See what I'm saying?
Absolutely. No, and I think it's absolutely correct to root the war in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. We in the U.S. sometimes put ourselves too much in the center of the story. U.S. matters a lot to this conflict, but it's not probably the precipitating agent. So can say two things in that regard. I do think that the U.S. is important. This is all highly speculative. We just don't have good evidence for Putin's decision-making, and that needs to be acknowledged up front. But I think that when Putin looked at the U.S., say from 2019 to 2021, which is probably when he made the decision to invade, he saw a lot of possibilities. I do think that he was probably waiting to see if Trump would get reelected, and maybe in a second Trump term. We know from the recent Peter Baker, Susan Glasser book that Trump was really considering pulling the U.S. out of NATO in his first term, and maybe that would have been more intense, or maybe Putin thought it would have been more intense in a second term. And so he may have had a wait-and-see attitude in that regard. Of course, when the election doesn't go Putin's way, I'm assuming that that's how he saw it, that may have been part of his decision-making process. I think January 6th matters, just making the country look like it's in disarray. And then, of course, the pullout from Afghanistan also matter. So if you look at the U.S. uncharitably, as Putin does, you can create a narrative of a country that's internally divided and not doing well in its foreign policy, and this might have made it seem like a good moment to strike.
But I guess what I'm getting at from this article, it appears that Russia and Ukraine were still looking for a way out of
exactly.
Again, the post-2014 morass.
Exactly. So you have certain American factors, maybe in the big picture sense they matter. It's possible. I'm sure that the U.S. does matter to this story. If we could ever get access to the information about the decision-making, it would be very interesting to see, of course. But I think Ukraine matters a lot more. And in two ways. I mean, there's the Zelensky story. So there were these initial bursts of optimism. Zelensky campaigns in 2019 as a peace candidate. So he suggests that he can maybe make certain concessions or work with Russia to sort of wind things down in eastern Ukraine. And Putin and Zelensky meet, I believe, in the fall of 2020 in Paris. There are signs from the Ukrainian population that they don't want Zelensky to go too far with this. He definitely started to get political pressure not to reconcile with Putin, if that's what he had in mind. So Zelensky kind of hits a wall in terms of what he can do with Minsk, or maybe he thought it was too easy when he was campaigning and just realized how hard it was when he was governing. And then when Biden is elected, I see a change in Zelensky where he becomes a little bit more confident about issues such as NATO membership for Ukraine. And then there's something that he creates called the Crimean platform, where there's a bit more international pressure for people to recognize that Crimea is occupied territory, that it's annexed. There, too, Putin just didn't see what to work with. So he doesn't take Zelensky that seriously. I think he wouldn't have invaded if he had. There's the reference from the New York Times article about Zelensky as a comedian. But I think he's also irritated by the direction in which Zelensky is going. And that's one phase of, or one core of the decision-making for Putin. The other core of the decision-making is much more long-term. And this is Putin's own failure, the failure of his own policy. So he invades eastern Ukraine in 2014, 2015 to get a lever over Ukraine. He feels like he's losing control of the country, and he wants to sort of have this lever over Ukraine's future and destiny. His actions in 2014, 2015, the annexation of Crimea, invasion of eastern Ukraine, alienate him from the Ukrainian public. And they push the Ukrainian public toward a much more pro-Western stance than was the case before 2014. So Putin's own policies are failing in this regard, and the war is in some respects an answer to that failure.
That's a great point, because for some time prior to that, you could find Ukrainians who would have been okay letting the Donbas go. And weren't the Minsk agreements designed to settle the issue with the Donbas, to have it as an autonomous region within a sovereign Ukraine?
Well, the Minsk agreements are, they demand, I feel reading them is a little bit like reading a short story of Franz Kafka. I mean, it's very hard to know what it means. And it's unbelievably confusing. On the Ukrainian side, what Minsk was supposed to mean was that that the Russians would get out militarily, that there would be elections under Ukrainian law, and that there would be a degree of autonomous status for Donetsk and Luhansk as regions of Ukraine, but nothing very different from what was there before. In other words, it was a way to get back to the status quo ante. On the Russian side, it was impossible to say what they meant by it, but they had a different sequencing, and sort of clearly they had something more like a kind of carve-out for this region where they would have veto power over Ukrainian foreign policy. And so they just spun their wheels on this for
both sides
5-6 years.
Pointing the finger at the other.
It was definitely a kind of agreement that failed to get any agreement on anything important.
How has the war influenced the way U.S. leaders view our national interests? We've gone from Obama in 2016 saying Ukraine is not a core U.S. interest, but it is a Russian one, something that I continue to agree with, unpopular opinion, as the kids say. We've gone from that to the liberal world order will be threatened if Ukraine falls, to borrow a quote from Robert Kagan, his recent essay in Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. The democracy versus autocracy framing that we hear from not only President Biden, but public intellectuals such as Timothy Snyder and others. So I kind of just answered my own question, Mike. You got a lot of patience sitting in here with me. So why don't you take a hack at that?
Well, the U.S. is not easy to characterize in this conflict. If you compare it to the Baltic republics and Poland, where the war is understood to be something existential for them, that if Ukraine were to lose, if Russia were to win, they truly believe, or the majority of their populations believe, that they would in some sense be next, either to deal with a ascendant Russia on their borders, or perhaps even through invasion of their territory by Russia. That's not a minority view in these countries. It's the majority position, and it really infuses the attitudes of their governments. The United States can't really be compared to those countries for the following simple reason. the vast majority of Americans do not feel great fear when they look at Ukraine. They feel compassion for Ukrainians, which is absolutely merited. They do feel a sense that this is important to Europe, and Europe is important to the United States. It's not immaterial to the United States. But I think after the first couple of months of the war, it's kind of receded into the background. So obviously American citizens want their country to kind of come out ahead in supporting Ukraine and in dealing with Russia. But I don't think that there's a huge level of anxiety, fear, or perhaps even engagement at this point in what's going on with the war. Whether that's good or bad is sort of another question. But the U.S. is far away. And the U.S. is safe in many respects from a lot of the immediate implications and consequences of the war.
But the liberal world order.
Exactly. So that's the complexity. So the U.S. is also not Portugal. And in a way, it's not France or Germany, which have done certain things to keep a distance from the conflict and maybe to keep certain channels and avenues open to Russia. So the U.S. government has a view that's kind of in between. On the one hand, the U.S. government, I think, sees this as very important for the future of Europe, and I think that they have to be right about that.
I would agree with that, yeah.
If the war would sort of explode out of its boundaries, if Russia would be a dominant power on the territory of Ukraine, that this could really change the dynamic of Europe, and that obviously matters greatly to the Biden administration. It is one explanation for why they've poured a lot of resources into this conflict, but they have also, in subtle ways, checked some of those tendencies on the part of the U.S. government. U.S. government has military power at its disposal that it's not using in Ukraine. About aircraft, where Biden has been very skeptical about providing that to the Ukrainians, and I think that there are sort of other domains. Obviously, American troops in uniform are not going to be a part of the conflict. The Biden administration has been adamant about that. So I think that there is an effort on the part of the Biden administration not to let this go overboard in terms of U.S. conflict with Russia, and also to sort of maintain the possibility that this will end in a somewhat messy negotiated settlement. You do get that message from certain Biden administration officials, which would suggest that this is of great concern to the U.S. It does touch on core American interests, but it's not of ultimate or absolute concern, that the Biden administration is navigating this. And I think that that has to do with the nature of the conflict, has to do with the nature of American power, which is not something that you would want to intertwine too much with a direct confrontation with Russia, but also has to do with American public opinion. And the Biden administration has to recognize that there is not the strong foundation of bipartisan support for its activities in Ukraine that there was for much of the Cold War for U.S. policies then. So that's a subject for another podcast, Martin. But the domestic politics of us also are a bit of a limit on what Biden can do.
I think the danger is believing that we can actually affect a positive outcome here. Right now, it does look like we're having a positive effect on Ukraine's fate, right? They've been able to withstand, after 1 year, Russian conquest. But my issue with people who push this democracy versus autocracy, Ukraine is the front line, the fate of the liberal world order is tied up in Ukraine's fate, folks who push that argument often don't consider the possibility that prolonging the war can also threaten this world order, because wars escalate and they can spill into new countries and even in this case, escalate to threats or use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's a profound concern. Wars, on balance, don't contribute to liberal orders, and they don't contribute to order at all, by definition. In a way, wars imperil stability and order. And you raise, I think, a very profound question about the ways in which this conflict or this war could go wrong for the United States. And it's very, very important, even if that doesn't happen, it's very important to have that as a consideration. In a different sense, if too much is pinned ideologically on the war, there's another kind of risk. It's not only
trap yourself.
It's not only that the war could lead in directions that destabilize and, in a sense, make the world sort of less deliberative, less cooperative, which is the core idea of the liberal international order. It's not just that. It's that the U.S. has to recognize that for countries like Poland and the Baltic republics that have very strong interests connected to the war, claims about democracy are important. And it is important that Ukraine is a democracy and Zelensky is an elected.
Agreed.
That's important to the war, and it's important to you could say it's important to the world. But that the war is itself a kind of crusade for democracy outside of these countries that are directly affected by it, that hasn't panned out for the Biden administration. So you have democracies like
Hungary,
South Africa, Brazil, India.
That's right. They're not on board with that.
Indonesia, who have their own opinions about the war and are not thrilled, I think, about what Putin is doing and see the war as in many respects unjust, but they don't see liberal order or international order as at stake with the war. And certainly they don't see the questions that matter to them as democracies as, in a sense, being determined on the battlefields of Ukraine. So you have to make sure, if you're in the Biden administration, if they're going to make these kinds of claims, you have to make sure that they really persuade and that they have a kind of global integrity. And I think there it's been a very, very checkered story for the Biden administration. I think it's just sufficient to say the people of Ukraine deserve a decent future. And if the U.S. can help contribute to that decent future, however it is, through diplomacy, through economic support, through military support, that in and of itself is a good and to the good. To make it a crusade for democracy, if you think back to American history over the last 120 years, there are lots of ways in which we need to be cautious, skeptical, or perhaps just not use that framework for this conflict.
This war should not be viewed as a source of national rejuvenation for the United States to reassert its global leadership. I think that's dangerous, and people can point to all the times the United States has violated the post-1945 order. And
yes, I mean, I think that you wouldn't want to will a war as national rejuvenation under any circumstances. I mean, William James has an incredible essay from the time he was thinking about, Spanish-American War and U.S. becoming something of an empire at the turn of the 20th century, an incredible essay called The Moral Equivalent of War. And what he was arguing in that essay is that the country needs to find the moral equivalent of war, because wars do mobilize and they create this great energy and they can accomplish they can move mountains, wars. William James wanted to see the moral equivalence of war, that sort of energy put to other purposes than war. So if we're to have crusades in this country, kind of mobilized, moralistic movements, let's have it on issues that are sort of connected to domestic politics or problems in American life and not, sort of international crusades about democracy.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, part 2 of this series, 1 year of war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.